This lecture will be on how to cite primary sources in Chicago style. So citing primary sources can be tricky. If it's a book, of course, you just cite it like a book. But sometimes it's not a book. Sometimes it's a letter or a diary or something else, and it can be very confusing how to cite it. A couple of general rules, though. You should try and cite according to the rules for the closest type of source. So, for example, if you have like a government pamphlet that's pretty thick, it might make sense to cite it as a book, right? The key thing, though, is however you cite it is to provide clear information so that someone else can replicate your work, right? They have to have enough information so they can clearly identify and find your primary source. And you may, in fact, need to explain what your primary source is in a footnote and discuss how you are going to utilize it and where you found it. So, for example, sometimes I use primary sources that are located in archives but have been reprinted. So a lot of times I'll say, this can be found in such and such an archives. I'm using the printed source, which can be found in this volume or something like that. But the key thing is just information, right? As long as you give me the information, I can help you to figure out what's the best way to source it. Now let's start off with one that could be kind of tricky. And this is oftentimes what you find because you're going to maybe use a primary source that is a collection of other of sources that has been published. So like, they'll copy a journal or they'll take a bunch of shorter primary sources and put them in a book. So oftentimes then a primary source collection will have an editor. Sometimes you may be using works that are in translation. And sometimes you will use works that have multi-volumes, right? So let's just go through one that gives you an idea. So there was a book called The History of the Korean Catholic Church, written by a man named Charles Dallet. He wrote it in French, and I don't read French, so I use the Korean version. So if I was to cite this, I would give the author's name, Dallet Charles. Then I give the Korean romanization, right? Hanguk Chonjukyoesa. And in brackets, I include the translation, right? So if you use a foreign language source, usually you need to include the translation after the brackets. In this case, this book was translated, so now I write translated by Chae So-gu and An Eun-yeol. And you may recall from, that's a lot like what you would do with an edited volume, right? When you cite a chapter from an edited volume, you would have the editor there, right? You have the author of the chapter first, then later you have that. Very similar format. So translated by such and such. If the work was edited, instead of a translated book, you would have edited by, and then you would give the editors. If you have both, what I find is easy to do is just say edited by such and such, and translated by such and such, period. Then this is a work that appeared in 3 volumes, so you write 3 VOLS, 3 volumes, right? And then it has the publisher, which is in Korean, so I've romanized it there. Now, I just want to give you the example of the footnote. For the most part, you know these rules from the secondary sources. So the thing I just want to focus on is the page number that appears at the end. You'll notice it says 1:11 through 18. You may recall from a previous lecture that whenever you see that, that's indicating volume number. So this, remember from the bibliography format, this was a 3-volume book. So 1:11:18 means pages 11 through 18 of the first volume. Now here's a style that you may occasionally have to use. What if you have to cite a footnote? There may actually be times that you have to refer to a footnote. And so what you do is you write the page that the footnote appears on, and then N, meaning note, and then the number of the footnote. So to understand what this means, 1: means volume 1, page 253, and then footnote number 4. Right. I think one source that is pretty common that you'll run into that you may need to use are letters. And again, as we talked about before, you need to be able to find where you got the letters. So for example, let's say you get the letters from an archives. You would describe the archives where you get them from so someone else can get the information. And what's nice is usually archives will tell you this is how we want you to cite our archives. Makes things very simple. Other times you might get them on websites, in which case you want to give the website information for the letter. But the key thing also with letters, you don't need to list them separately in the bibliography, just the collections where you found them. So sometimes in your bibliography, you would just include an entry for the archives. Sometimes that's taken care of in the footnote. You'll notice a lot of times when I'm talking about primary sources, I'm kind of ambiguous, and that's because oftentimes we just have to make a system that works depending on the exact collection or source. The major thing is we need to be able to see where you got the information from. People need to be able to replicate it. I can help you with that. If you cite it from another source, you have to give who sent the letter to whom and the date it was sent from, and then the bibliographic information after it, right? And I'm going to give you a concrete example now of what I mean. So in this case, you have taken a book, you found like a book, right, that has a collection of letters. And in the first part, right, this author given for this book is Paulina Jackson, right? That's actually the person writing the letters. But in any case, Paulina Jackson would serve as the author here. So Jackson, comma, Paulina. And then you give the information who wrote the letter to who. Paulina Jackson to John Pepys Jr., comma, and then the date, right? Letters are usually dated. And this makes things really easy because the author, the reader now knows when this letter was written, around the time, the historical context, all that wonderful stuff. And then it says, in the letters of Samuel Pepys and his family circle. Notice that's the same format being used for a book chapter in an edited volume, comma, edited by, exactly same format. Now in this case, right, the book is not divided so much by page numbers, it's divided by letter number. So instead of giving the page number for the letter, the range, they chose to give the number. So this is letter 42 in the collection. Like I say, things can be different with the primary source citations. I'm just giving you some examples. The major thing is that people can find it, and I can help you sort this out. And as we've seen before, whenever we're doing footnotes, we make a few changes. So in this case, this is Henry Adams to Charles Mills Gaskell. This book did not have an author. It had an editor, so we just start off with that first information, who's writing the letter to who. In this case, the location was included, so we include that London. That's where the letter was written from, March 30th, 1896, in Letters of Henry Adams, and it's just, again, following that book chapter format. Here they used a page number instead of a letter number. Another source that you're likely to use is a newspaper. And for a newspaper, you include the author, comma, this is a footnote, and then you have the article title, comma, quotation mark, and then in italics, you have the newspaper title, comma, and then the date of the newspaper. You do not necessarily, it depends on your professor, but I do not require page numbers. Usually the page numbers are not all that useful. A lot of times newspapers don't even, especially older ones, don't have page numbers. One thing also I want to point out, newspapers, especially older ones, often did not include the author, the reporter's name. In that case, you start off with the title of the newspaper article. Sometimes those old newspapers, especially the smaller ones, do not even include a article title. They'll just have a bunch of text with no title. In that case, you start with what you do know, which might just be the newspaper's name. So it might just read Chicago Tribune, July 1st, 2005, if you have an article that has no title and has no author. That is fine. Usually those papers are so small that it's relatively easy to find the article being referred to. When you are dealing with a bibliography with newspapers, you do not need to cite every individual article. You just would cite the newspaper name, right? So the New York Times, that's it. You wouldn't need to do anything else in the bibliography. Magazines are very simple, right? Very similar to newspapers, right? Bibliographical style, last name, personal name. Then you got the article title in quotation marks, then the name of the magazine in italics, so very similar to journal article, and then the date, footnote, same kind of rules. Periods become commas, name order is in the usual order, and so forth. Very simple. Now, what's really complicated and confusing is, let's say that there is a part of a primary source quoted in another article, and you want to use that source, but you don't have access to the original source, right? This may be just a partial translation. So, for example, I might cite something in an article in Korean and translate it into English, but the whole translation has not been published. So you need to cite that in a very particular way if you want to refer to that. So you give the usual information, right? And then the information on where it is actually appearing. And this is really complicated. So let's say that there's this article written by this guy, Louis Zugofsky, called Sincerity and Objectification. And it's referred to by this person, Bonnie Costello, in her book. And you really want to refer to the article, but darn it, you just can't get that original article for some reason. Maybe all the, since 1981, maybe all the copies of that article have been destroyed. Maybe for whatever reason you can't get access to it. It's fine. The way you deal with that is you would cite the original article and then the article that you're referring to that actually quotes it, right? Because it'll be weird to me, like if I'm your reader for your paper and there's this article and I'm like, oh, I want to find that article and I can't find it, I'll be like, what's the student doing, right? Well, then that's why you would include this. So what you're doing is you're saying, I'm referring to this original article, but I don't actually have access to the original article, but I do have access to this book by Bonnie Costello that actually refers to the article itself, and you can find the information I'm referring to there. And again, this is what you would do with the footnote. Very simple. You're just going back to how we normally make this transition: names reverse, periods becomes commas, and so forth. When in doubt, though, as always, ask your professors, but first I would encourage you to have a look at Kate Turabian's A Manual for Writers. This is a very useful book. There's also a Chicago-style manual that's even bigger than that, but I would use this one first. Or alternately, a really wonderful site is the Purdue Online Writing Lab, OWL. They have a lot of great information. But like I said, with primary sources, I've given you some basics for how to try and start doing it. Just do your best. The major thing, remember, is that I should be able to see where your information is coming from clearly. I can help you with the format and maybe moving things around later, but the key thing is make sure you've got that information.